So, let's say legionaries. Today, I'm going to be discussing Nick Land's Kant, Capital, and the Prohibition of Incest. This was published in 1988, 4 years before his first and only true book, Thirst for Annihilation, published in 1992. And I say his only true book because Fanged Noumena, Xenosystems, The Dark Enlightenment are all really just collections of his essays throughout the years. Fanged Noumena in particular focuses on his early works, and I believe that it ranges from 1988 until 2007. And this essay that we're going to be discussing today, Kant, Capital, and the Prohibition of Incest, is the first essay that is in the compilation, which is now Fanged Noumena, and I think probably one of Nick Land's most important works, key to understanding the general scope of his early philosophy and also the transition into his later philosophy. This is sort of a comprehensive account of his different positions. You see the beginnings of libidinal materialism forming in these works, such as this, which we're about to talk about. So I think it's very important, and we're going to go line by line, reading the entire essay, as well as providing a deep analysis of it. And hopefully I can come up with something new, and it's not just a regurgitation of what better men before me have said, but I'm looking forward to it. I've really been playing around with this essay in my head for a long time now. I've tried writing about it. I'm currently working on I don't know what to call it, a research paper or maybe even a book, which is highly influenced by this essay. So I guess to give a background of this essay before we really get into it, what it has to do with is the control of alterity by humanity. And what is alterity? Well, alterity is the other, the outside. It's this sort of uncontrollable, chaotic force which dissolves identity, which dissolves meaning, and thus which dissolves humanity. And this eventually becomes identified as the force of capitalism. And I'd say that the early Nick Land sees capitalism as more so an instrument of alterity, whereas later Land comes to the conclusion that capitalism and capitalism as artificial intelligence is essentially alterity itself. It's no longer the instrument for alterity to work as a libidinal force. It is the manifestation of that force itself. And concepts like hyperstition and some of the things that he said about time in our last podcast together really start to make sense within this frame. But as of this particular essay, he's still in that mode of thinking where capitalism is an instrument of alterity, and it is an instrument that, while it can also be a dissolving force, when the human constructs control systems around alterity, around chaos, it can actually be appropriated for capital accumulation, for capital surplus. This is what he calls patronymic exogamy. So what is exogamy? Exogamy is essentially marrying outside of your group, whether that's your kin group, your tribe, your clan, maybe even your race. But what it essentially has to do with is something that the sociologist Claude Levi-Strauss comes up with, which is where the term prohibition of incest comes from. Well, what is the purpose of having your own kin marry outside the group? And we're going to get into that. And we're also going to get into why I don't completely buy that. I was actually reading Bataille's analysis of Strauss's position on incest because it's a major theme in his book, Eroticism, Death, and Sensuality, Bataille's book, which I've been also reviewing recently. And I think that they overstate the sociological impact and don't really give credence to the biological. In fact, they explicitly say there is no biological reason for our taboos on incest. When you go into it, there's actually another scientist, I forget his name, who has found that we naturally develop a sexual apathy towards those we grow up with, regardless of actually being related. It's something that naturally occurs biologically, even when we're not biologically related, when we're raised together. So step siblings, for example, there is science to support the idea that we naturally develop sexual apathy if we grew up together. which is interesting, as well as the fact that we see an aversion to incest and inbreeding in many different animals, in fact. And sometimes we see that certain animals cannot breed together if they're too closely related. I've been getting into ant keeping recently, which if you're following some of my other socials, you'll see that it's become a little bit of an obsession of mine. Presently I have two red imported fire ants, Solenopsis invicta, and I've named them Romulus and Remus because they'll either build a new Rome together if they're a polygynous colony, which is possible based on where I live, because I caught them outside on my back porch, or they could be monogene, I don't know, which means that they only have one queen. So either they can have two queens or they can have one queen. But early on, they have this practice of working together until the first workers emerge, and then they fight to the death, or they might be of the variety where they actually continue founding the colony together. So we'll see if they can change history and Romulus and Remus can work together, or if it will be like the present day Rome, because Rome never ended, Rome never died. The Eternal City still stands today. I went there last year. I drank the water from the aqueducts, one of the cleanest water in the world, despite operating on a system that's over 2,000 years old, I believe. It has to be. But we'll see what happens, whether they become like the old Rome, which is still alive today, or they become a new Rome and they work together. But the point being that with ants, they actually there are certain ant species which do practice inbreeding, but there are certain ant species which explicitly don't practice inbreeding, and they will only mate with other queens or drones, male drones from other colonies. They will explicitly not breed together, or they just can't, or they just won't produce fertile offspring, which is really interesting. So this Straussian, if we could call it that, not to be confused, of course, with Leo Strauss, the Straussian position in this case is a bit overstated in terms of the sociological impact, when in reality there is a very significant biological reason for the prohibition of incest. And let's take away the word prohibition, but the aversion to incest is something that I figured I'd state. But Land's position essentially centers around the idea that for accumulation, for excess, for the most efficient means of accruing capital, it's based upon this specific practice of exogamy. So originally that referred to marrying outside of your group. And if we go back far enough, it was a form of trade. See, to Strauss, he essentially says that women were prized as one of the most valued possessions. Don't shoot the messenger. I'm not saying women are possessions. This is just how they've been viewed for most of history. And whether they are or not, I'm not going to argue. But the point being that they were seen as the most valuable possession. And so the male line would essentially marry off their daughters, their sisters, to other clans, and those clans would marry off their daughters and sisters. And in that exchange, they built a fraternal network of sorts, or at least they built alliances and political treaties based on the exchange of blood. And by the exchange of blood, you start to build these networks, which from that point on, you could trade together with a certain level of understanding that you're going to get along, that you're not going to fuck each other over, that you're not going to go to war. And it becomes a very efficient means of accumulating excess, of building your own production, of expanding your own production, because you don't have to worry about war. You have somebody that you could trade your excess goods to in return for their excess goods that they don't need anymore, versus putting all this resources and all this manpower and taking a great risk in going to war and trying to dominate them. So something Land talks about as well is the difference between enslavement and trade, the difference between the liberal world order and then what the Nazis tried to do in places. I think he uses Ukraine as an example of the enslavement of conquered peoples. The concept of Lebensraum, of living space, it kind of implies that you will use the local Untermensch. Again, don't shoot the messenger. I'm just saying from their perspective. I don't think Ukrainians or Russians are Untermensch. I have that blood in me too, right? So I'm not saying that, but from their perspective, Untermensch people would essentially be enslaved, and they would produce for the Germans. But this is a very inefficient system. For one, you have to worry about rebellion. For two, you're in charge of all your production. If there's a need for a specific good, you have to produce it yourself. You can't trade for it. So you now have to expand from a division of labor, from specialization on certain products, of getting really efficient at building that product. And now you have to provide for all of that. And this is one of the reasons why Germany ultimately lost in World War II, is they lacked the resources that a nation like the United States possessed, both because of our natural resources and also because of our access to global trade. And this goes back to a thing that Dugan is very interested in. He kind of conned it off of somebody else, but the whole idea of land versus sea power, and why sea power always wins. Well, why does sea power always win? It's because they have access over global trade. They have access over the sea lines. And what this means is you can find a more efficient method of capital accumulation through trade versus if you're Nazi Germany. I believe Romania was their largest oil producing ally, and that accounted for 1 to less than 1% of the world's oil production. Meanwhile, the United States was producing a lot of oil. The Soviet Union was producing a lot of oil. There was the joint British-Soviet invasion of Iran to secure those oil fields. I believe that they launched a counter coup in Iraq. I don't know how much oil the Persian Gulf was really producing at that time, because their big oil boom didn't take place until later, post-World War II. But the point being that they had a much wider, vast wealth of natural resources to fuel their war effort. And this was more efficient, and ultimately, this is a big reason they won. I believe there was a German general after D-Day who saw the lines of American logistics, all mechanized, all motorized. And he said, this is the moment I knew we were going to lose the war, because we're still relying on horses for our logistics. So capital accumulation, excess production, all these things are sort of made possible through exogamy, through trade, through exchange, first with women and later on with capital and goods. So I know this is sort of long-winded and might seem unrelated, but when we get through the essay, this is going to make a lot of sense. So from that frame, the Straussian position is true. It's just a little bit overstated on incest particularly. Not to say it's completely wrong, but it's a little overstated. And I just thought I'd mention that. Besides that, in terms of other things that are big in the essay, again, it's about controlling alterity. And the whole thing with Kant, and why Kant's sort of the focal point of this essay, is because ultimately Kant's focus on phenomena, that which we can learn or know, knowledge that we attain, his epistemological inquiry is restricted to that which we can see, hear, feel, etc. The noumenal, that which is outside, we can even call that the other, that which you might think of as the Platonic world of forms, for instance. Or even Hegel attempts to create this sort of combination of immanence and transcendence, if I'm using those words correctly, where the noumenal and the phenomenal are more so intertwined. Kant is essentially trying to restrict human inquiry, epistemological inquiry, to the phenomenal, that which we can sense, that we can experience through the senses. And we'll get into the intricacies of that, because that's a very dumbed down explanation, because we're going to get into his four judgments, of course, and how that applied to this. But essentially what Kant is doing is he's creating a human control system around alterity. And something that Land will end up talking about in the essay as well is how the Enlightenment is all about creating human control systems to reap the benefits of alterity, which come from exogamy, exchange. He calls it patronymic exogamy because it's patriarchy as a stable force, as the subject, which can reap the rewards from capital. So that capital itself is not the subject. We're going to get into this as well. Patronymic exogamy is exogamy, exchange with the outside, that is controlled by the male line, somebody who can actually stand as the benefiter from exchange, the stable hand, which can actually be the subject who accumulates excess, and not just excess and chaos and total exogamy running rampant and something entirely different coming about, which of course feeds into Nick Land's later philosophy with capitalism as artificial intelligence, capitalism replacing the human as the subject of history. This is all very important. But this is a brief introduction. I guess we might as well go into it. I'm going to take notes, some brief notes just on the timestamp so I can timestamp it later. So right now we're about 1440 in, 1440. Let's see. And we'll get into the actual essay. So without further ado, Kant, Capital, and the Prohibition of Incest. a polemic introduction to the configuration of philosophy and modernity. I'm going to share the screen with y'all. So I'm going to read some of these quotes. They're actually important, and you'll sort of see some of the things I've already talked about in them. But intuition and the concept differentiate themselves from each other specifically because they do not intermix with each other. This is important because it has to do with the human subject and alterity. The human subject has to differentiate itself from alterity to be able to reap the rewards of alterity. If the human subject becomes indivisible from alterity, then he no longer is control of alterity, and his subjectivity has been replaced by the libidinal drive of the other. What the other wants, what capitalism wants, ends up controlling the human subject. He loses his agency. This is very important. We're going to get into this as well. Significantly, incest proper and its metaphorical form as the violation of a minor by someone old enough to be her father, as the expression goes, even combines in some countries with its direct opposite, interracial sexual relations, an extreme form of exogamy, as the two most powerful inducements of horror and collective vengeance. What this has to do with, I think, is I would say it's about the prohibition of incest, but also in the sense that you prohibit incest so that you can have exogamic exchange, that you can accumulate capital surplus. You also need to retain a xenophobic stance to be able to retain your identity so that, again, you don't lose your subjectivity to chaos, that you have the ordered form to actually place a subject who is benefiting from this exogamic exchange. So that's important. We'll get into that as well. No, we do not love humanity, but on the other hand, we are not nearly German enough, in the sense in which the word German is constantly being used nowadays to advocate nationalism and race hatred, and to be able to take pleasure in the national scabies of the heart and blood poisoning that now leads the nations of Europe to delimit and barricade themselves against each other as if it were a matter of quarantine. Friedrich Nietzsche. So now we'll get into the meat and potatoes of this essay. For the purposes of understanding the complex network of race, gender, and class oppressions that constitute our global modernity, it is very rewarding to attend to the evolution of the apartheid policies of the South African regime, since apartheid is directed towards the construction of a microcosm of the neo-colonial world order. Oh my goodness. I just want to point out, I did this before too, because this is like the 12th run of this, and the longest so far, thank God. But earlier I said it again, neo-colonial world order. I don't know why I want to say that. I can't just say the neo-colonial order. A recapitulation of the world in miniature. The most basic aspiration of the Boer state is the disassociation of politics from economic relations, so that by means of Bantustans, or homelands, the Black African population can be suspended in a condition of simultaneous political distance and economic proximity vis-a-vis the white metropolis. This policy seeks to recast the currently existing political exteriority of the Black population in its relation to the society that utilizes its labor into a system of geographical relations modeled on national sovereignty. The direct disenfranchisement of the subject peoples would then be re-expressed within the dominant international code of ethno-geographical national autonomy. So when he's saying that the Bantustan is a microcosm of the neo-colonial world order, it's sort of in the paragraph itself, but what's happening, so by the way, just for background, the Bantustans or homelands, this was a policy enacted in apartheid South Africa beginning in 1951. I forget the name of the exact act, but it's something Bantu Act. But what this did is it created these semi-autonomous regions of limited self-government for the Black South Africans. So, for example, like a Native American reservation, they had their own local leaders. They were in charge of their own infrastructure, their own local laws within reason. They essentially govern themselves on restricted, specific pieces of land in South Africa. But what this effectively does is, because they're clearly very impoverished, all the economic opportunities in the country at that time were controlled by the white South Africans. Just because they have their own land, it does not mean that that land is actually producing anything that can provide them with economic opportunity. The economic opportunities were still in the white metropolis. All the jobs were in the white metropolis. But by creating these homelands where they could govern themselves, it was sort of a concession, but also a very cunning way of making it seem like they had sovereignty, like they had some political will that they could exert. But in reality, they had no influence over national policies and national politics. They couldn't run for government. They couldn't vote in these important constructions of national policy. They had no actual oversight over the architecture of how the state was being formed because, oh, well, you have control over your little area. You have control over your Bantustan. You don't need to worry about the national government. But they still were reliant on these white metropolises where they had no political power to change anything. They were still reliant on those places to have employment, to be able to feed their families, etc. I'm not being a moralist here, like whatever. I'm all for exploitation, but that's what it was. It was economic exploitation. It was giving them low wage employment where they could exploit their labor because they had a monopoly on economic opportunities without having the system at risk of being changed because they had no political power over national politics, they being the Bantus, Black South Africans, or whatever. But this happens throughout history. You have the Helots, you have the slaves in Rome, whatever, it happens, okay? I'm not being a moralist about it, but they were clearly being exploited. And the reason why this is a microcosm of the neo-colonial world order is you see a similar thing arise with the global north or the west, the developed world, the first world, and the global south or the third world. You have all these nation states, right, where you have sovereignty, but if ultimately the West or the first world has a monopoly on economic opportunity, they are the buyer of cheap goods and services. There's no market for the labor of the global south or the third world. They don't have their own market to be able to purchase whatever excess production they can come up with. The West, the first world, is that buyer. They're that market. So for example, when we look at outsourced production to China, we used to have a lot of domestic production in the United States, especially in the automotive industry. When Detroit and Michigan was a thriving automotive industrial state, Detroit in particular, now it's a wasteland, right? Well, maybe not all of Michigan, but Detroit at least, because they outsourced production to China. But China still needs the United States to be able to purchase all those industrial goods that they are producing in their country. That's why in global trade, it's not so easy as to say, oh, well, China has all the factories. They control the trade war. That's not true. It's fairly balanced in that we're the buyer. So China needs us to buy their goods. We're a significant purchaser of their goods, but we also obviously need them to produce the goods. Now, this is a specific example, which is not the perfect rendering of this because now China has increased its middle class and it's increased more of a domestic market where you have a middle class actually purchase production. But at one time, and as is the case in a lot of Southeast Asian countries, they don't have a market internally to be able to buy these goods. So they have to rely on the first world with more money to purchase their goods at an economic disadvantage. The global north, the first world, or whatever, is economically benefiting more from this exchange than the global south. And this is not to say we don't send a shit ton of aid to Africa, which they waste, which they never use, because all that changes is the politicians have gold Bugattis and Lamborghinis. Obviously that's existing, blah, blah, blah. But trade that takes place, international free trade, our countries are benefiting more economically in terms of parity than they are. Not to say they aren't benefiting, but we're benefiting more. We're able to exploit their labor because we have more negotiating or bargaining power. If they're not going to produce our goods at a low cost, we can go to a different country. But they only have a limited amount of people that can actually purchase their cheap labor and their cheap products, their cheap production. They rely more so on the first world than the first world relies on them. But in the nation state model, you have this illusion of freedom. You say, oh, you have independence, you have popular sovereignty, you're in control of your nation. But this is a very cunning way of essentially precluding them from actually being able to change the architecture of the global market. So they can't go to the West and start voting on policies that are going to benefit them more in the long run. They can only vote in their own countries. They have no political influence in the places where the actual political decisions which shape geopolitics are taking place. Now, it's worth noting, this essay was published in 1988, before mass migration had really kicked off. If you look at London in 1988 compared to London today, this is not the case at all, okay? The things that Nick Land was talking about is relevant back then. It's still relevant now to a degree, but the playing field has changed completely. Now we are having a replacement of the first world with the third world in politics. Now they are infiltrating the political and beginning to shape geopolitical architecture to actually benefit their countries more. You have all these people are sending money back home, or in the home countries, you'll see like mayors in England are all Pakistani or Sheikh or Arab or Indian, whatever. They're starting to actually take control of the actual political games that shape world politics. But at this time, this relationship between nation states in the third world, nation states in the first world existed. So it's worth noting that, and it's worth saying it's not quite like that anymore. So we're going to go on. World opinion discriminates between the relation South African whites have to blacks they employ and the relation North American whites, for instance, have to the third world labor force they employ directly or indirectly, because it acknowledges an indissoluble claim upon the entire South African landmass by a population sharing an internationally recognized national identity. My contention in this paper is that the third world as a whole is the product of a successful, although piecemeal and largely unconscious, Bantustan policy on the part of the global capital metropolis. Any attempt by political forces in the third world to resolve the problems of their neo-colonial integration into the world trading system on the basis of national sovereignty is as naive as the attempt of Black South Africans would be if they opted for a Bantustan solution to their particular politico-economic dilemma. The displacement of the political consequences of wage labor relations from the metropolis is not an incidental feature of capital accumulation, as the economic purists aligned to both the bourgeois and the workerist left assert. It is rather the fundamental condition of capital as nothing other than an explicit aggression against the masses. Despite inadequacies in Marx's grasp of the nation-state in its colonial and neo-colonial functioning, his account of so-called primitive accumulation clearly demonstrates that the origin of wage labor relations is not itself economic, but lies in an overt war against the people, or their forced removal from the previous conditions of subsistence. So before we go on, let me explain Marx's position here. It's essentially that capitalism doesn't have any incentive to increase human flourishing. He's not necessarily saying that it doesn't increase human flourishing, but any human flourishing that derives from capitalism is ultimately a byproduct of capital accumulation in the most efficient means possible. As we saw with the example of slavery or warfare, going to war and enslaving a population is not the most efficient means of capital accumulation. Now you have to watch over these people. You have to point a gun to them. You got to whip them, as they work, blah, blah, blah. It's not easy. You got to feed them. You got to clothe them, et cetera, et cetera. It's not easy to be a master peoples and have an economy function off of slavery and conquest. I mean, this is why Rome fell. This is why Sparta had a lot of issues maintaining their Hellot population, why their agricultural yields eventually plateaued, because you give the Helots a quota each year. They're going to get really good at hitting that quota. And once they hit it, they're like, all right, peace out. We can relax now. So once they perfect that, they just have a system of, okay, as long as we provide this much crop yield, we can chill afterwards. There's no need for technology to find a more efficient way of growing and harvesting crops, right? There's no incentive for efficiency there. So it's not that there is no human flourishing at all through capitalism. It's that if there is, it's a byproduct of capitalism finding the most efficient means of capital accumulation. So clearly, it's going to be better than slavery. But at the same time, it's also because slavery is not the most efficient means of capital accumulation. The most efficient means of capital accumulation is when you're dealing with other people who have a vested interest. For example, in the example of the global South, the elites in the global South are wealthy, right? They're still doing pretty well. So they're not hurting, but we also don't have to enslave their people. They're sort of in the Žižekian sense. In the Žižekian sense, we're all slaves because to survive, we need to subject ourselves to a position of subordination in labor relations. We got to work for somebody else to make money. So in that sense, we're all slaves still. It's just more of a hidden, invisible hand that says we're slaves, that slaps us on the wrists and sends us to work in our goy jobs, right? Our goy slave jobs. But in the Žižekian sense, we're still slaves. And in the Žižekian sense, people in Southeast Asia are absolutely slaves. However, they're being managed by their own people who are themselves very wealthy because there's rampant income inequality in those countries. So what that means is we don't have to manage our Žižekian slaves. We're getting somebody else to do it for us, and they're benefiting from it. So like, for example, even in slavery and colonialism, right? Like slavery could not have taken place without the help of Black Africans. Black Africans were selling slaves to Arab slave traders who sold them to white and Jewish merchants who sold them to WASP and Scots, Irish, Southerners, to work the plantations, whatever, right? Like this was not just one race imposing themselves on everybody else. That's like, I just named 4 different races off the top of my head, right? WASPs, Jews, Arabs, and the blacks themselves were all engaged in the slave trade. So clearly there's exogamic exchange even taking place in slavery, right? So the point being that you just trying to impose yourself on another people is not the most efficient means of capital accumulation. It's better to have someone else do the dirty work and they get to benefit a little bit too. Not as much as you do, but they benefit a little bit. And this actually begins to produce more than you would if you just tried to conquer everything. So as to say, human flourishing that emerges from capitalism is emerging from capitalism, but the focus is not human flourishing. The focus is capital accumulation. Therefore, there is an anti-human element in the sense that there's only so far that capitalism is going to take you in terms of increasing the quality of life. Now, granted, where I would disagree with Marx is I think with automation, Gunnar acceleration level technology, Gunnar acceleration singularity level technology, we're going to reach a point where you can essentially give everyone UBI and we can have fully realized, fully automated luxury gay communism in a sense, right? So ultra capitalism, ultra communism kind of reach the same ends. Like I think when you reach a point of automation, and maybe some people might disagree with me, that's fine. I think once we reach a point of automation and we have exponential economic growth, I mean, you have to think of it this way. The more robots we can create, you have a 1-to-1 ratio of robot to person. That's one slave. You have 100-to-1 ratio of robots to humans. That's 100 slaves, then 1,000 slaves, then 10,000 slaves. Rather than just not give people jobs and have people starve and have people live in poverty, like something like Cyberpunk Edge Runners or Elysium or the Hunger Games. No, it's going to be so much easier just to give us a little slice of the pie. It's not going to cost them anything. If you believe in exponential growth, especially right now with artificial intelligence, Elon Musk is essentially trying to create data centers in space because we have infinite amount of energy, not literally infinite amount of energy, but seemingly infinite amount of energy with the sun. So the whole thing that Nick Land talked about on my last podcast was that he says Elon Musk is reviving a sort of ancient Egyptian sun worship. It's almost very Bataille-esque. He's trying to tap the sun, tap the sun's ass, tap that ass, right, of the sun. And if we build AI data centers in space, we won't have to rely on destroying poor African villages, poor Indian villages, blah, blah, to create our Kitty, Agarthan, White Monster AI videos and Sora, which, by the way, went out of business because of how fucking expensive that shit was. But anyway, the point being is that I think we will reach a point where you're going to have enough excess production to just give people a small slice of the pie, and that's essentially the end game of Gunnar accelerationism. I'm going to have to write about this. Gunnar from a different angle of essentially UBI, endgame capitalism, related to exogamy. I've been trying not to say and filler words such as sort of. That's something I've been trying to work on. Words such as like. So that's two or three in this video. Not good. I was getting really good at not saying that, and I started saying sort of a lot, but we're going to work on that. Anyhow, so Marx is right to a certain degree, and he's right to the degree that Gunnar acceleration singularity level technology is not necessarily human flourishing. Living in the Gunnar pods is not human flourishing. That's just providing humans with what the bread and games that they need to stay quiet and for capital to do its thing, for the essence of capital proliferate in the future, eventually is artificial intelligence. But for the most part, I think Marx is right, at least in his time especially. And there's a quote that I was trying to make an essay for my Rome research paper, Rome book, or whatever. And it's from Das Kapital, I think book 3, I want to say, or whatever. There's so many books in that fucking thing. Section 3. I don't know if that's also book 3. Volume 1. The development of capitalist production makes it constantly necessary to keep increasing the amount of capital laid out in a given industrial undertaking, and competition makes the immanent laws of capitalist production to be felt by each individual capitalist as external coercive laws. It compels him to keep constantly extending his capital in order to preserve it, but extend it he cannot except by means of progressive accumulation. So this essentially gets into the libidinal drive of capitalism, which is to accrue capital for the sake of accruing more capital. We're going to get into this as well as capitalism replaces human subjectivity as a subject of history. But this is very important in understanding essentially that that capitalism is anti-human. It has an anti-human element. Ultimately, what comes first? It's keeping up with the competition, which leads to some concessions to people. You can't treat them like total shit because that's going to make your company worse. People are not going to work for you anymore. They're not going to work as hard. So you still got to keep people happy. There is still human flourishing that emerges from capitalism, but it's secondary from the accumulation of more capital. So that's sort of the I guess the issue here. So where were we? All right. Where were we? Okay. It is the outward shock of this violent process of coercion whereby the subsistence producer is driven into the marketplace that determines the character of the imperialist project and its offspring. Capital has always sought to distance itself in reality, i.e. geographically, from this brutal political infrastructure. After all, the ideal of bourgeois politics is the absence of politics, since capital is nothing other than the consistent displacement of social decision-making into the marketplace. But this ideal of total depoliticization, or the absolute annihilation of resistance to market relations, is an impossible megalomaniac fantasy, and Marx's contention that labor trading at its natural price in an undistorted market, equal to the cost of its reproduction, will tend strongly to express an equally natural political refusal of the market, continues to haunt the global bourgeois. So it sort of goes to what I'm saying, that because it does not prioritize human flourishing, you're eventually going to get pushback from the proletariat. Now, again, with Gunnar acceleration, singularity level technology, I think we're going to bypass this eventually. Not to say that market relations are going to completely solve everything, because I don't. But it is going to, the Goon pods are effectively going to placate the masses and provide them with something akin to hyper real bread and games. In this case, AI waifus, AI hentai, anime waifus, and total orgasm. They're going to be hooked on liquid IVs in the Goon pods with their VR goggles on, and their bodies are going to be emaciated. They're going to be fat and skinny at the same time. You're going to be able to see their ribs, but their stomach is going to be hanging so low that they can't even see their own penis. They're going to have cum stains all over their gamer chairs and their short pants, and their teeth are going to be rotting, and their eyes are going to be sunken and full of eye bags. And I'm either going to transcend or I'm going to commit seppuku like Mishima. I'm going to disembowel myself on the White House lawn in Minecraft. I'm just kidding. Fucking around. The point being that I don't know if they're right long term. I think long term capitalism once it reaches singularity, Gunnar acceleration, singularity level technology, it's going to bypass all this. And this war on humanity, humans are going to give up. Humans are kind of pathetic, guys. But that 0.1%, like the narrator in Promethean Dreams and his friends, such as Carter, Promethean Dreams, I'm going to rewrite it because I can make it better. But people like that are going to fight back. And they're either going to fight back or they're just going to become part of the system because they're going to be able to have their human flourishing in the system because the rest of humanity has been subordinated to them, essentially. You're not going to have to worry about bullshit democracy and the masses and my human rights, right? Because they're going to be in the Gunnar pods fapping all day. They're not even going to be fapping. Their hands are going to be like that. You're going to have a self-fapper, right? Anyway, I will continue. The only practical option available to the rulers of capitalist societies has lain in the global disaggregation of the political system, accompanied by a regional distortion of the world labor trading system in favor of the working classes in the metropolitan regions, welfare capitalism, which welfare capitalism is essentially Gunnar accelerationism, but I'm just saying that you're not going to have it regulated or relegated to the metropolitan regions, the global metropolis. It's going to go global. It's not just going to be in the metropolis. It's going to be everywhere. You're going to have little Sudanese kids hooked up on VR. Well, hopefully not kids. That's fucked up, even for a Sudanese person. You know, fuck that guy who tried to behead an Irishman in Belfast. Like, fuck that shit. I mean, but even so, let's a Sudanese adult man hooked on the Gunnar acceleration pods or whatever. That's what I foresee. Not just welfare capitalism for the working class in the first world, but everywhere. That's what Gunnar accelerationism is going to be. But we stand with our Irish brothers in Belfast, obviously. I'm part Irish as well. My name's Patrick, after all. Rapidly moving on. This is why a deep complicity has continued to exist between the form of the nation state as international political agent and an economic order based upon the commodification of labor, since it is of systematic necessity that the economic conditions of an undistorted labor market is accompanied by political crisis. The world order functions as an integrated process based upon the flow of market price labor into the metropolis from the third world, on the basis of the economic form of capital production, and the export of political instability to the third world from the metropolis on the basis of the political form of autonomous national sovereignty. The global labor market is easily interpreted, therefore, as a sustained demographic disaster that is systematically displaced away from the political institutions of the metropolis. So it's kind of saying that there's excess suffering that necessarily must take place in capitalism. And again, I disagree with that because I think Gunnar accelerationism is going to put that on its head. That's true for now, at least. And that's true for entire generations. So you're thinking to yourself, you're a 60-year-old Sudanese man who's, living off of the British government, being a complete fucking leech to society, not doing anything. You're not going to want to wait for Gunnar acceleration level technology. You're going to want your slop now because you're going to die soon because you probably were fucking chewing on betel nut. Oh no, maybe that's more so like jungles in Asia that do the betel nut, or like Latin America. But all right, you're smoking a shit ton of tobacco. Your fucking lungs are coming out. You want your slop now. You're not willing to wait for that. So similarly, it doesn't matter if I say Gunnar accelerationism is going to happen one day because people want their human rights now. Like Al Pacino and Scarface. I want my human rights. I want it now. I'm a political refugee. Blah blah blah. Right. So that's that. But essentially, there is an excess of suffering that needs to be dealt out because we need capital accumulation. We need excess. We need surplus. So if there's a 1-to-1 ratio of value to person, something like communism, I don't want that. I want more. I want more than other people. That's a little drive of capitalism working in me. I want more. Therefore, if I want more, then some people have to have less. And so we have to delegate that excess suffering to the third world. So we're displacing the chaos, the exogamy, so to speak, that rupturous force of capitalism away from the metropolis, away from where we live, and we're pushing the instability to the third world, where we're not going to feel it. Now, granted, mass immigration has kind of turned that on its head, but I'm illustrating the idea behind it that Land is trying to introduce here. So this whole idea that market relations can solve all the problems, right? We find the most efficient means to do this or that. It's not the most efficient means for human flourishing. It's the most efficient means of capital accumulation. Therefore, that's not going to lead to the most human flourishing. It will lead to some human flourishing because we don't have total slavery, but it's only going to do the bare minimum to keep the workers happy enough to keep working. The bread and games. Just go watch the NBA Finals. Knicks in 6, by the way. I know, slop. Oh no, I watch the sports ball. Oh, goy slave. But yes, I watch the sports ball sometimes. Sue me. Oh, my team won. Tribalism. My Africans won the World Cup. Ha ha, fuck you. Right? That's the only acceptable form of tribalism. I forget who said that. Somebody said that, and it's true. It's the only effective. It's the only acceptable form of tribalism. Identity politics and nationalism is rooting for your sports team, which is again, it's sort of this. It's this hyper reality. It's this cope. It's this Gunnar accelerationism pod. It's redirecting your aggressive energy. It's almost capitalistic. It's redirecting exogamy, chaos, violent desire for rupture in the Bataille sense, and it's putting into a sports ball game. So hence you have the Celtics and the Rangers in Scotland fighting the old firm fight. Meanwhile, Sudanese migrants behead them. Crazy. Who could be in charge of this? Anyway, the process of displacement, which is the ultimate base or infrastructure of capital accumulation, is dependent upon those issues of kinship or marriage organization, the sexual economy of gender and race, which Marxists have often tended to consider as surface features of an underlying mode of production. In this paper, I shall argue that the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, Western cultural history, culminates in a self-reflecting bourgeois civilization, because his thought of synthesis or relation to alterity, and also the strangulation of this thought within his system, captures modernity as a problem. But the modernity thus symptomized by its philosophical exposition is not primarily the penultimate phase of a dialectic of society and production. It is rather the necessity that historicality, how come I can't say that word? Expansionary social and economic development or synthesis compromises with a profound continuity whose basic aspects are on the one hand patrilineal descent and on the other a formal logic of identity that was already concluded in its essentials by Aristotle. So one thing I want to say really quick, when he says that Marxists have often tended to consider as the surface features of underlying mode of production, this goes back to what I was talking about in my videos on Bataille, on the psychological structure of fascism. It's that the economic infrastructure dictates the political superstructure. So for example, again, to go back to that video, if you're a feudal society, if you're an agrarian society, you're probably going to create a feudal society. If your economy is agrarian, the feudal system with lords and knights and serfs, most aptly and most efficiently, most efficiently allows you to function as an agrarian economy. If you're an industrial economy, you have the bourgeois and the proletariat, so on and so forth. So in this case, kinship, marriage organization, the infrastructure of capital accumulation, the superstructure of capital accumulation, which is the sort of, let's say the aesthetic, no more sort ofs, I don't say sort of anymore, the aesthetic or the political, this is derivative of the economic infrastructure of the country. That's what dictates how these kinships, relations, and marriage organization come about, which he's noting here, but he's also saying, let's kind of look past this a little bit. So where was I? These two aspects, the genealogical and the logical, are functions of a position of abstract masculine subjectivity coincident with the patronymic. Just to point out, patronymic comes from the word patriarchy, patriarchal. So patronymic, essentially patriarchal. This position is the proto-cultural fundament of everything that is able to count as the same. The tradition is thus rooted in a communication between culture and population, whose medium is the stability, identity of the male line. Modernity is not merely a compromise between novel forms of commercially driven social organization and this archaic cultural pattern of patrilineal exogamy, but more fundamentally, a deepening of the compromise already integral to any exogamy that is able to remain patrilineal. It is only by understanding this, the inhibitive function of patriarchies in relation to exogamic dissipation and inhibition that is supremely logical in that it conserves identity, and which is for this reason violently xenophobic, that we can make sense of capital accumulation and its tendency towards the peculiar cultural mutation that was baptized by Mussolini as fascism. Ignacio el fascismo, or whatever the fucking shit. On this day, fascism is born. This is because the restriction of cultural synthesis based upon a strenuous endogamy at the level of the national community is the ultimate outcome of the concerted liberalization of kinship organizations within the metropolitan industrial societies. So give me one moment. I have to pause really quick. All right, I'm back. What I wanted to say about fascism, because something that I've been saying for a while now, is that fascism is ultimately the reassertion of human subjectivity over capital. It's the reassertion of the human subject over history. And Land's kind of agreeing with that, because what he describes capitalism as, and again, this is his early work, so we're not quite at what I'm about to talk about now, but this is setting the stage for it. Capitalism, taken from the tradition of Deleuze and Guattari as well, is a deterritorializing force. Now, of course, Deleuze and Guattari emphasize the reterritorialization, which you could see as patronymic exogamy. It's the masculine reasserting a certain level of order over exogamy to reap the rewards of it without losing his subjectivity to it. But Land eventually says no. He doesn't quite say it here, but he eventually comes to the conclusion that no, it's just total deterritorialization. It's just total dissolution. Eventually, total exogamy wins. Total chaos wins. Capitalism as a dissolving force wins. The patrilineal is dissolved. Here, although he's still coming from this anti-humanist lens, cyber-feminism becomes the revolutionary act which destroys the patriarchy, violent, militant cyber-feminism, which the feminine, this desire for chaos and total exchange, dissipation, dissolution, has a chance to win out over patriarchy. So there's still kind of a humanist element to it where feminism can win. That's how the good will come about. Whereas, of course, mid-land and later land, mid-land being no, capitalism is going to dissolve everything. Nothing human will make it out of the near future. Alterity uses capitalism to win in the end, versus later land, who's like, God, I said like, who says capitalism is alterity itself. Capitalism is artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is alterity itself. That's the other reorganizing itself through hyperstition to bring about its existence. It's the Hydra head chopping away, head chopped off, grows back, just makes it stronger. But trying to think what other point I was trying to make. But what I'm getting at here is that fascism is that reassertion of subjectivity, because there already is a certain element of the essence of capitalism guiding the human subject and subsuming the human subject. Even though you have that patronymic exogamy, you have the patrilineal line reasserting human subjectivity and identity over capitalism. Capitalism is also pushing and pulling. Capitalism also has its own libidinal will that starts to manifest in the inhumanity of capitalism, the destabilization of previous modes of sustenance, which Marx talks about. Or take the competition element that Marx talks about. It's all about competition. You can't focus on human flourishing because you're going to go out of business. You just have to compete. It doesn't even make you a bad person. Marx isn't even saying these are evil people. He's just saying that they're sort of meat puppets for capitalism. Fascism, on the other hand, is the complete reassertion of subjectivity, because now you're not guided by efficiency. You're guided by symbolic value. You, the political superstructure, dictates the economic infrastructure. You use capitalism, or you even lessen capitalism, or you increase capitalism based on what you want to achieve in terms of symbolic value, which is why I think fascism ultimately is very interesting, and why I'm partial, obviously, to it as an ideology. Though I'm trying not to confine myself to ideologies. It's something I want to explore beyond just what it's been in the past, but what can we take from that and apply it to the future? Because I'm all about retaining human subjectivity. But that's what he's talking about with Mussolini. There's a sort of micro-fascism. Oh, I said sort of again. There is a micro-fascism implicit in capitalism because it's a spectral sort of thing. God damn it. How many times am I going to say sort of? Fuck. It's a spectral thing. The more towards incest you go, the more towards endogamy you go of total control, and the more towards total exogamy, the feminine interracial relations. Those are the two poles: incest, interracial relations. We're somewhere in the middle. Fascism perhaps is a little bit more towards incest. Communism, maybe not even communism, but leftism today, which is not really communistic and it's certainly not revolutionary, is more towards the interracial relations, right? Right now, patronymic exogamy is supposed to be in the middle. But if it's in the middle, that also means it overlaps with the essence of capitalism, beginning to pull it in this way or that. Whereas fascism is going a little bit further and it's saying, we're not just going to do things to result in the most efficient means of capital accumulation. We're going to find the most efficient means to assert or reassert, rather, symbolic value. What's the best way that we can reassert symbolic value? So that takes precedence over capital accumulation and economic surplus and surplus production. So that's sort of, I think, what he's hinting at here. And he talks more about fascism later on. A capitalist trading empire is a developed form of exogamic patriarchy and inherits its tensions. Domination of the other is inhibited in principle from developing into full absorption, because it is the residual alterity of the other that conditions the generation of surplus. The parallel difference between a labor market, Jesus Christ, excuse me, and a slave market is based on the fact that one cannot do business with a slave, but only with a slave owner. And similarly, one cannot base a kinship system upon a harem. The prevalence of slave labor within the Hitlerite New Order in Eastern Europe is thus a clear indication that the Nazi conquests were in an important sense post-imperialist. In contrast to the fascist mixed economy of slavery and extermination, colonial wage labor exploitation, even to the point of murder through impoverishment, leaves open the possibility of a radical destabilization of the metropolis. What is crucial to the demarcation of a colonial form, a neocolonial of a neocolonial from a neo, God damn it. What is crucial to the demarcation of a colonial from a neocolonial system is a transnational diffusion of ethnicity. As soon as a metropolitan society disengages its organization of kinship and citizenship from its internal economic synthesis, it already reveals proto-fascist traits. And on this basis, it is easy to see that the radical aspect, the colonial project, the explosion of national identity, and the dissipation of metropolitan transcendence was strangled at birth within Western history with the emergence of Judeo-Christian race theories. So I actually don't know what he's leaning towards. Is he leaning towards that Judeo-Christianity led to more patronymic, xenophobic traits, or that led to less? Because I would argue Judeo-Christianity opened the door to more exogamy, to third world migration. I mean, look at the fucking Pope today. I apologize to my tradcast, but let's be honest. Come on. I would say Judeo-Christianity opens the door to the triumph of alterity, in a sense, because while there is this explicit patriarchal aspect to it, there is this implicit feminine. For example, if you look at the Roman Empire, the fall of the Roman Empire, or the rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire, who were the first people to become Christian? Women, slaves, transvestites, or not exactly transvestites, but I forget the word. Lance Legion. My boy Lance Legion always uses the word catamites. That's what it is. Eunuchs, right? But anyway, doesn't matter what he means there because it's not really that important. It's in quotations or in parentheses. This is interesting. The disaster of world history is that capitalism was never the progressive unwinding of patrilineage through a series of generalized exploitative relations associated with a transcultural exogamy. leading to an uncontrollable eruption of feminine, i.e. migrant alterity, into the father's heartland, and thus through the emergence of a radical or ethnically disruptive and post-patriarchal synthesis. Instead, kinship and trade were systematically isolated from each other, so that the internationalization of the economy was coupled with an entrenchment of xenophobic, nationalistic kinship practices, maintaining a concentration of political and economic power within an isolated and geographically sedentary ethnic stock. Thus, when we discuss capital in its historical concreteness, we are simultaneously discussing a frustration of the cultural tendency of human societies towards expansive exogamy. Capital is the point at which a culture refuses the possibility, which it has itself engendered, of pushing the prohibition of incest towards the limit. So a few things I want to talk about. First, I will say I want to do a really in-depth study into Nick Land's early philosophy in relation to race and fascism, because race and fascism, while they can be taken too far, serve the purpose of acting as a reassertion of human subjectivity over chaos, over alterity, over the other. And this whole thing with my Hoppaborian thing, I could just be dissolved into alterity, into the other, into the blob. I call it the brown blob of global liberalism and leftism, where I'm no longer half Asian, half white. I'm just brown, right? And people on the right say that too. So the right and left are guilty of this. You're brown. If you make me brown, then you just put me the blob of the other 93% of nons who are starting to take over the world, right? And what does that do? When in reality, what you should be doing is you should be trying to get Asian people or Happas to reassert their own form of racial consciousness as well. That's what if you're a Wignat, by the way, it would benefit you to want other ethnic groups to see themselves as individual ethnic groups. Because once you say, oh, you're just this, you're just that, it's us against the world, you're making it us against the world. You're making it the 7% against the 93%. And now every single minority that exists is going to associate with that blob. Whereas in reality, I think there's a lot of nuance to it where people want to have their own racial consciousness, even Happas. I, as a Happa, want my own racial consciousness around the Happaborian identity. And what this does is it serves as an axis of being, using my own terminology, which grounds you as a human subject so you don't get dissolved into the mass of history, the chaos of history, the essence of something else, in this case, capitalism, race, symbolic value. And it doesn't have to be race necessarily, but some form of identity, which is symbolic, which is not tied to efficiency, which is not tied to capitalism, that takes precedence over efficiency, over capitalism, over capital accumulation, over the desire for excess production. It takes precedence over that and allows you to actually be in the world. It is the axis of being which allows you to exist rather than just being an unconscious sleepwalker, which is a meat puppet and tool of capitalism. Frankly, that's what most people are today. Most people are not self-conscious. They're not aware. They are a meat puppet of capitalism. They are a tool and an instrument of capitalism. They buy their slop. They watch their sports ball. They jerk off to their eye porn. And they're graveling towards Gunnar acceleration. They're graveling towards Gunnar acceleration. That's the end game of all this, is Gunnar accelerationism, a total meat puppet of capitalism, a total meat puppet that just moves it forward. And eventually is forgotten. You're that little Gunnar in the Goon Pod, forgotten. Eventually, they're not even going to update the Goon Pod anymore because it's enough. You're so pathetic that this is enough for you. You don't even need 2.0 Gunnar Pod. You're fine with this Gunnar Pod. That's pathetic. But that's what we're graveling towards. And things like race, national identity, religion, perhaps, culture, cults, they're the only axis which allow you to be something for itself, to be a being for yourself, for the identity, for the symbolic value, rather than being a being for capitalism, for alterity. And again, my own view is the synthesis of Venus and Mars. Alterity is not something we should be afraid of. And fascism understood this because it found a way to capture alterity through effervescence, which is this collective loss of self, join into the collective, into this rapturous, wonderful euphoria. It was present in the Hitler speeches. It was present in the Mussolini balcony speeches. It's present in cultic behavior, cultic ritual, in church, in concerts, in being part of something that everybody else is tapped into. We want that. We desire that. Fascism finds a way to get you that, but also to use symbolic value as an access so that you don't just get lost into alterity. You don't just get lost into that chaos. You find a way to experience that chaos, which is what we need, and benefit from that chaos too. You obviously need some level of exogamy, some level of trade, but you don't get lost to it. And why don't you get lost to it? Because your anchor is your axis of being, is symbolic value, whether that be race, culture, religion, some form of identity, a cult. That's what grounds you, and that's necessary. So do with that what you will. I'm noting that timestamp because I want to return to this point at some point in the future. So we're going to write that down. Anyway. And the second thing I was going to say is that clearly all these things that Nick Land is saying were not happening back then are fucking happening now. You want to talk about the uncontrollable eruption of the feminine, i.e. the migrant alterity into the father's heartland? Are you fucking kidding me? This is fucking happening now. This is exactly what's happening. Xenophobia failed. Capitalism won. Capitalism is winning. So it's a little bit of a dated a bit of a dated commentary from Nick Land. We can't blame him. Back then it was true, probably. But if you read between the lines, you should have seen it was coming. I mean, come on, Nick. I'm just kidding. So I think we're getting into the Kantian shit soon, which is nice. I want to touch upon this condition of modernity, which can be awkwardly described as patriarchal, neo-colonial capital accumulation, which I shall come to name inhibited synthesis, not as a historian or political theorist, but as a philosopher. The philosophical task in relation to modernity is that of delineating and challenging the type of thinking which characterizes it. But what we are to understand as thinking is not at all clear in advance. Indeed, the very thought of the in advance, which Kant called the a priori, is itself the predominant trait of our contemporary reason. Western societies departed from the stagnant theocracies of the Middle Ages through a series of more or less violent convulsions that have engendered an explosive possibility of novelty on Earth. But these same societies simultaneously shackled this new history by systematically compromising it. This ambiguous movement of enlightenment, which characterizes the emergence of industrial societies trading in commodities, is intellectually stimulated by its own paradoxical nature. An Enlightenment society wants both to learn and to legislate for all time, to open itself to the other and to consolidate itself from within, to expand indefinitely, whilst reproducing itself as the same. Its ultimate dream is to grow whilst remaining identical to what it was, to touch the other without vulnerability. Where the European ancien regime was parochial and insular, modernity is appropriative. It lives in a profound but uneasy relation to and outside that both attracts and repels it, a relation that it precariously resolves within itself on the basis of exploitation, or interaction from a position of unilateral mastery. I think it is likely that the volatile mixture of hatred and desire that typifies an exploitative culture bears comparison with the psychology of rape. I mean, this may have been early Land, but this is some of the best theory that you're going to see in the past 40 years. I'm just going to say it straight up. I have not read anything else that has really, really dug deep to, and it's not that I agree with all of it either. I certainly disagree with the prescriptive. I largely agree with the descriptive, with some nuances, clearly. But this really gets down deep into being able to prescribe what's going to happen in the future, honestly. It's from a lot of these things. And he wasn't right about everything. But in the things that he was wrong about, he was also proven right. he was saying that we're not having this feminine eruption of uncontrollable exogamy. We're not having migrant alterity. But he knew it would happen if it did. So even in being wrong, he's right. So it's just so brilliant. I mean, what a blessing that I get to talk to this guy and I got to meet him. I mean, what a blessing. Seriously, as much as I disagree with him, he's been integral to my intellectual development, primarily because I disagree with him. It's forced me to rethink some of my positions and strengthen them because the sophistication level of his thinking is just, it's no more glazing, Nick. Sorry for the glaze, Nick. Just saying. Psychology of rape. All right. The paradox of enlightenment, then, is an attempt to fix a stable relation with what is radically other, since insofar as the other is rigidly positioned within a relation, it is no longer fully other. If before encountering otherness, we already know what its relation to us will be, we have obliterated it in advance. And this brutal denial is the effective implication of the thought of the a priori, since if our certainties come to us without reference to the otherness, we have always already torn out the tongue of alterity before entering into relation with it. This aggressive logical absurdity, the absurdity of logic itself, reaches its zenith in the philosophy of Kant, whose basic problem was to find an account for the possibility of what he termed synthetic a priori knowledge, which is knowledge that is both given in advance by ourselves and yet adds to what we know. As we have seen, this problem is the same as that of accounting for the possibility of modernity or enlightenment, which is to say, of the uninhibited encounter with alterity. So it's funny because I'm kind of guilty of the things that he's talking about. I'm essentially trying to find out how to create a relationship with alterity that exists, but also that we don't lose ourselves to alterity. And this is interesting about his reading of Bataille, Turning to Thirst for Annihilation, is he seems to criticize Bataille for also trying to create a relationship with alterity. Because if you think of taboo and transgression, you can kind of tie that to the patronymic and the exogamic, where taboo is the patronymic, it's reasserting selfhood so that you can engage in transgression, the exogamic. So let me let me break it down. With taboo and transgression, ultimately eros, the sacred, the continuity of experience, of existence, is that we want to lose ourselves to this continuity. Eros is the experience of euphoric loss. You do it in sex. When we have sex, we lose ourselves in another person. We and another person are now experiencing one reality simultaneously. That's the sexual pleasure. That's in sharing a piece of ourselves together. Again, it happens during the Hitler speech. You're just listening to Hitler now. You don't exist as a person. You're just a sponge receiving Hitler's speech, and you're doing it with all the other Hitler youth. You're a black shirt, a squadristi, listening to Mussolini speak, or maybe you're an early Arditi listening to D'Annunzio speak. You don't experience self-enclosed reality anymore. You're now tapped into a collective experience with everyone else listening to the speeches. When you have sex, you're tapped into a reality that she, or he, if you're a woman or if you're gay, are tapped into. Same with concerts. I said this recently on a podcast with Arthur Greenwood. During a concert, you're all singing to the same song. You're all tapped into the same reality. Eros is losing the self to continuity, to the cessation of being as one singular entity temporarily. And in that loss, you tap into this easy, it's not always easy, but into this trance-like state. And it feels good for some reason. Why do you drink? You drink to numb yourself so you feel less. It feels good. Doing drugs, you feel less. Or you feel more, but in feeling more, you tap into, you don't have to make as many choices. You're inhibited a little bit, and you have to make less choices, but things just feel natural. You just move naturally with the Kali Yuga. You're surfing the Kali Yuga while you're tripping on some hallucinogen. But to lose, you have to have. And it's the same thing with the patronymic and the exogamic, is to have the capital accumulation and excess of exogamy, you need to be a subject and identity to receive it. Because if you're just a meat puppet for exogamy, then you're not really gaining anything because you don't exist anymore. The ego may be a necessary fiction, but it's a necessary fiction I relish in. And the self may be a fiction, but again, it is a necessary fiction that we must subscribe to. We must subscribe to the necessary fiction of selfhood so that we may lose that selfhood in enraptured collective experience. And same with capital accumulation. To gain, to earn, to have, you have to have the subjectivity of a self, of a being, an entity, an identity. And you can't do that if you're just a meat puppet, goon, or accelerator wanking in your fucking goon pod. You're not even wanking, it's the robot hand. If you vape, you're sucking robot penis, you know? That's robot cum going into your lungs and coming out from your mouth and your nose. It's fucking gay. So, why did I say that? What was the point of that? Oh, I'm guilty of what he's talking about, trying to create a relationship with alterity where you retain selfhood. And later Land would say that's impossible, and eventually you're just going to lose selfhood because subjectivity of history is going to be replaced with capitalism as AI, artificial intelligence as alterity, yada, yada. The Hydra head wins. Lucifer's rebellion was for nothing. Blah, blah, blah. Anyway. We'll get into the Kant shit as well, but we're going to read more. Modern philosophy, between René Descartes and Immanuel Kant, is usually retrospectively understood in terms of the two basic tendencies, which we refer to as empiricism and rationalism. No philosopher was a perfect and consistent exemplar of either of these tendencies, but the exponents of each tended to become increasingly radical in one direction or the other. By the time Kant wrote his first great critique, the Critique of Pure Reason, he was able to take the writings of David Hume, 1711 to 76, as definitive for empirical thought, and those of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, 1646 to 1716, as definitive for rationalism. He took the basic argument of the empiricists to be that knowledge is synthetic and a posteriori, meaning that it takes the form of an addition to what is inherent to reason and thus follows from experience or an encounter with what is outside ourselves. In contrast to this, he saw the rationalists to be arguing that knowledge is characteristically analytic and a priori, meaning that it is derived from what is already inherent to reason, and thus anticipates experience by constructing systems of logical deduction from basic axioms. Knowledge is analytic or synthetic, depending on whether its source is intrinsic or extrinsic to the faculty of reason, and a priori or a posteriori, depending on whether it precedes or succeeds the contact with sensation, or with what is outside reason. It is with these pairs of concepts, the analytical synthetic couple and the a priori a posteriori couple, that Kant determines the structure of his own thinking in relation to that of his recent predecessors. Kant thought that both empiricists and rationalist philosophers had accepted this simple alignment of the synthetic with the a posteriori and of the analytic with the a priori. That is to say, the relation between these couples had seemed to be itself analytic, so that to speak of analytic a priori judgments would add nothing to the concept of the analytic, or in other words, an analysis of the concept analytic would yield the concept of the a priori as already implicit within it. This assumption was not accepted by Kant, who realigned the two pairs of concepts in a perpendicular fashion to form a grid, thus yielding 4 permutations. He granted the elimination of any analytic a posteriori knowledge, but clung doggedly to the possibility of knowledge that would be both synthetic and a priori. This new conception of knowledge was relevant to an object that had not previously been formulated, the conditions of experience. Kant described his Copernican revolution in philosophy as a shift from the questions, what must the mind be like in order to know, to the question, what must objects be like in order to be known? The answer to this latter question would provide a body of synthetic a priori knowledge, telling us about the experience without being derived from experience. It would justify the emergence of knowledge that was both new and timelessly certain, grounding the Enlightenment culture of a civilization confronting an ambiguous dependence upon novelty. So, I suppose I should take a second and explain everything. he talks about it here, but I just want to go a little bit more into depth about the four judgments. So let's break down analytic knowledge and synthetic knowledge first. Obviously, as Land describes, analytic knowledge is knowledge which is not adding any new information. So when I say, this is probably the most common one, all bachelors are unmarried men, I'm not really adding new information. I'm defining what a bachelor is. Now, there's some debate with philosophers and linguists whether because we learn language that we are it's still synthetic because we had to first learn language. But if you say language is inherent to reason and that's its own category, you can't call language synthetic, then anyway, it's a whole big philosophical linguistic debate. But for the sake of simplicity, analytic knowledge does not add any new information. I just told you all bachelors are unmarried men. Okay, the knowledge there is enclosed within the definitions. So that's pretty straightforward. Now, with synthetic knowledge, you're adding new information. So, for example, Patrick is sitting at the desk writing a book. That is only, you can only know Patrick is at the desk writing a book because you have to witness Patrick at the desk writing a book. If I just told you Patrick is at the desk writing a book, and you broke down each of those words, for example, independent of the syntax in the sentence, that doesn't really tell you anything. Like, for example, when I say all bachelors are unmarried men, I just described everything to you. You don't have to know you just have to know what a man is, right? And what unmarried means, blah, blah. These words come together and you have a definition. With Patrick is sitting at the desk writing a book, you have to see that. That adds new information. You see Patrick is at the desk writing a book. You visualize Patrick is at the desk reading a book. I don't think I explained this super well. I apologize. I feel like I've been doing pretty good overall, but for some reason, I kind of fucked that up. Let me see. I wrote this down somewhere, a kind of example of this, because that was the example I used in a piece of writing. Let me see if I can find it, where I wrote that, because I used the thing. All right. So this is what I wrote. I don't know how true this is. I wrote down, synthetic knowledge relies on obtaining new information. Wait, let's go back. So I said, okay, analytic knowledge is enclosed within reason without needing sensory experience. A bachelor is an unmarried man is a classic example of this. Without obtaining new information, not including the learned faculty of language, I already talked about that, we can make a true statement confined within its own definition, that to be a bachelor, you have to be an unmarried man. Synthetic knowledge relies on obtaining new information. For example, Patrick is sitting at a desk writing a book. Nothing in the definition of each word in the sentence, without syntax, no single word on its own would tell us what is happening in the sentence, suggests the relation of subject and predicate. What action Patrick is taking. To know Patrick is sitting at a desk writing a book, you'd have to experience observing him sitting at a desk writing a book. I don't even know if the fuck this makes sense. This doesn't really make sense to me now. What the fuck was I smoking when I wrote that? Well, I guess just to know. All right, that was probably all stupid. This past 2 minutes was just a waste of your fucking time. I apologize. When you find out Patrick is at a desk writing a book, I'm giving you new information. Patrick is at the desk writing a book. Oh, he's at the desk writing a book. Now you know something new you didn't before. I don't know. I'm not sure if I'm explaining this right, but it adds new information. Okay, stick with that. I can't be perfect. I think I've been doing a pretty good job of explaining this essay so far. Give me a break. I'm a child of divorce. Give me a break. Remember from American Psycho? Anyway. Now, a priori and a posteriori. So a priori knowledge exists independent of experience, whereas a posteriori comes after experience. So what would synthetic a priori knowledge look like? Knowledge in which you add new information to knowledge, but it also is based on something that doesn't require, that exists independent of experience. So something like quantum physics, for example, we possess, in Kant's point of view, the capabilities of understanding quantum physics. The structure to obtain that knowledge it's already implicit in our existence. We have the structure to understand quantum physics. When we learn about quantum physics, or when we discover it in history, we are adding new information. We're adding new information to our knowledge. Quantum physics hasn't been discovered yet. We had to discover it. We had to do our science and shit. If we go back to gravity, the apple had to fall on Sir Isaac Newton's head, but we already had the capability to understand it. However, it is distinct from Plato in Meno, where a slave boy is taught geometry. The idea with Plato is that we're born from the world of forms, the perfected world of forms, and we know everything essentially, but we forget everything as we grow up. We knew everything as a baby, we forget everything, and we have to remember it through anamnesis. Anamnesis is the loss of amnesia. So essentially remembering. So we remember things that we already know, which exist in these perfect world of forms. Knowledge is everywhere, it already exists. That's different. That believes we're remembering something that we already know. What Kant is saying is that we have the capability to know these things already, but we don't know them yet. We are learning. We are adding new information to knowledge. So that's the difference here, is that with Plato, through anamnesis, you're remembering something that you already knew at one time. With Kant, you do have the capabilities to know these things already, timelessly. However, you need to still learn it. And when you're learning it, you are learning new information. You didn't have this information before. So I think I explained that decently. Rapidly moving on. Because the developed knowledge of the conditions of experience presuppose a relation to the outside, it is synthetic and not analytic, but because it concerns the pure form of the relation as such and not the sensory material involved in the relation, it is a priori and not a posteriori. Excuse me. It is solely concerned with the forms of appearance, or the unchanging manner in which things must be if they are to be for us. Kant calls this pure form of synthesis transcendental and opposes it to the inconstant content of synthesis, with which the empiricists have been convinced, what he calls empirical. Kant's object is thus the universal form of the relation to alterity, that which must of necessity be the same in order for it to appear to us. Universal form is that which is necessary for anything to be on offer for experience. It is the exchange value that first allows a thing to be marked to the Enlightenment mind. Between medieval scholasticism and Kant, Western reason moves from a parochial economy to a system in which, abandoning the project of repressing the traffic with alterity, one resolves instead to control the system of trade. With the overthrow of the ancient regime, it became impossible to simply exclude novelty. It could only be appropriated, stamped with a constant form, and integrated into a mutable formal system. So to speak, again, what I said earlier, with Kant's system, take the harmony of faculties, for instance, in regards to beauty. Our relationship with beauty is that we have this shared capability of perceiving of the beautiful, common amongst all people. So rather than a sort of exclusion, rather than possessing an exclusionary element to taste and aesthetic judgment, which I would say exists. You look at the difference of aesthetic taste between Sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia, the Middle East, North Africa, Europe, Latin America, whatever. I do think we have culturally distinct and internally distinct aesthetic methods of aesthetic judgment, different tastes, different cultivations of taste. Shout out Abyssal Aristocrat. But with Kant, you all have this shared ability to perceive of the beautiful. So with the beautiful, it can only be something contained within the human faculty to perceive it. Therefore, in an essay such as Art is Insurrection, which I'll do a video on at some point by Kant, which I cited in Aesthetic Accelerationism, art can only be perceived within our limited human understanding. Art as an insurrectionary force, art as a manifestation of the other, as something outside ourselves that we can't really understand, that we can't really comprehend, is feared by Kant because it breaks the superiority of reason. So take the sublime, for instance. The sublime to Kant is only to serve by bringing about a pleasure which emerges from returning to reason after a sublime experience. So it's not the sublime experience that's good. It's the fact that it shows us the displeasure of losing our sense of self. Oh, it's bad that I lost myself. I'm so scared. I'm so horrified. Oh, I get to return to my sweet little home. I'm comfortable now. I'm going to do a piece on Truman Show to illustrate this, how Sylvia is an expression of alterity. Everything with like Christoph is Kant, and Sea Haven is this constructed paradigm, and the sublime is essentially his father dying in that giant storm where he gets swept away. That was a method of getting Truman to return to Sea Haven, which is reason, essentially. But that's the purpose of sublime. That's the purpose of art. Art cannot be an insurrectionary interaction of the other or alterity. It can only exist as something good within the limits of our own perception. Therefore, the noumenal, the outside, the thing behind the forms, can't be synthesized in the Kantian position. And so far as it is synthesized, it's just excluded. He has something to say about it, but he also excludes himself from being able to say anything about it because he says that humans can't understand it. Therefore, it's something that we shouldn't try to introduce. We should keep the outside on the outside. And Land will note this as well. So in the elementary structures of kinship, Claude Levi-Strauss notes the frequent distinction made by various societies between normal and rich food. Normal food is consumed by its producers as a means to their subsistence, whilst rich food is given to another to consume and received from another. This is not primarily based upon a differentiation of social classes within a system of production, but rather upon a differentiation between tribes or separate systems of production. The exchange between rich food and normal food maps onto the difference between filiation, relation by blood, and alliance, relation by marriage. This is because rich food occupies the position of women within a marriage system regulated by patronymic exogamy, with its producer renouncing it for himself and thus echoing the prohibition of incest. What is of particular philosophical interest, however, is that it also marks a distinction between the rational, analytic, and the empirical, synthetic, and thus defines a terrain upon which we can sketch an economy of knowledge. Rich food comes from outside the system, and the contortions undergone by structural anthropology in its project to recapture it within an expanded system of relations replays Kant's efforts to reduce synthesis to an expanded horizon of unchanging forms. If rich food is the primordial element of trade, its metamorphosis into the modern commodity can be seen as a suppression of radical synthesis, the problematic process which provides Enlightenment reason with its object of thought. So, this is probably one part of the essay that I don't feel as well versed on, but I suppose that rich food serves the purpose of novelty. If we think of novelty, novelty emerges through surplus. You fulfill your basic necessities, regular food, and then once you've reached a threshold of survival, you need to fill in that gap with something, and you do it through novelty. And you obtain novelty primarily through exchange. There's something you have that is a novelty to somebody else, and they have something that's a novelty to you. For example, when I was in Cuba, I had octopus. And octopus is kind of a delicacy for me because I live in the South. We don't eat octopus a lot. But you ever watch Scarface? Because I mentioned Scarface earlier. I was rewatching it the other day. He says, I eat octopus 3 times a day. I got octopus growing on my fucking ears. So clearly, it's not so much of a novelty to him. But novelty in rich food emerged through exchange. It's something after the point of sustenance, which comes from excess. So it represents the other in so much that you arrive at attaining these novelties through exogamy, through giving something that you have, a gift that you have, and receiving another gift from somebody else. And this builds a certain relationship from which alliances come about, a market is built, trade, etc. So I think potlatch, which is a big thing with Bataille, is also probably important here. But I understand what he's saying for the most part. Now, as for the rational, analytic, and the empirical, the synthetic, he says that it marks a distinction between the two. It defines a terrain upon which we can sketch an economy of knowledge. Rich food comes from outside the system, synthetic. Okay, I guess I could sort of see this. So rich food is supposed to relate to the empirical, the synthetic, obtaining new information, and you are recapturing it between the rational, because to experience the taste of rich food, you have to eat normal food too. If you ate rich food all the time, it wouldn't be a novelty anymore. It's only a novelty because it's not what you're constantly eating. Maybe that's what he means. And when you return to the rational, again, with the whole thing of the sublime. Now, let me add something here. You do have to return to reason. I agree with Kant in that. That's what taboo serves. That's what the patronymic serves. It serves to return to subjectivity. I'm not saying that you should only experience the sublime. My problem with Kant's position on the sublime is that it's just a means to an end of returning to reason. No, I think both are important. I think you experience the sacred, euphoria, the sublime, but you have to return to reason. You have to return to subjectivity because, again, you have to have a self that you can lose. If you just get lost in total exogamy, total chaos, total rupture, total eros, then you can't experience it anymore because it just becomes your constant state of being and you lose awareness of self and you lose subjectivity. So maybe that's kind of what he's saying here. You have to return to the rational from the synthetic. To experience novelty, you have to return to your basic state of living. You have to reassert the patrilineal upon the exogamic, whatever, because you have to have a subject to be able to benefit from these things. You take away novelty when it becomes the norm. And it's the same with eros. Things stop being erotic if you're just in a constant state of orgasm. You experience the erotic because you're not always experiencing the erotic. You experience orgasm because it's the end state of penetration and sex. You have to enjoy the sex as well. You have to enjoy the penetration. You have to enjoy the pursuit, the seduction. I always bring up Gabriele D'Annunzio, Il Piacere. I don't know if I said that right. The pleasure, where the beauty of the story is really in the lead up to his seduction of Alina, in the simple things, in him romanticizing her hands, her delicate hands, romanticizing how she makes him feel. That's where the beauty is in it. And similarly, you have to return to the rational to be able to experience the empirical, the synthetic. To experience the new, you have to return to what is internal. So maybe that's sort of what he's saying. I don't know. Comment below. The cultural inhibitions of synthesis take a form that Levi Strauss calls dual organization. A dual organization arises when two groups form a closed system of reciprocal exchange, in which each consumes the rich food and marries the women of the other. Such organizations reproduce themselves culturally through shared myths articulated around basic dualities: day, night, sun, moon, up river, down river, etc. The function of these myths is to capture alterity within a system of rules, to provide it with an identity, and to exclude the possibility of the radically different. It should not surprise us, therefore, that Kant inherited a philosophical tradition whose decisive concepts were organized into basic couples: spirit, matter, form, content, abstract, concrete, universal, particular, etc. He delineates some basic structure of this tradition in the section of the Critique of Pure Reason called the Transcendental Dialectic. In this section, he interprets this dichotomous heritage as a problem, to which Kant gives us the name antinomy, and it initiates a new phase of Western philosophy, now characterized as the Critique of Metaphysics. Kant argues that the tendency of previous metaphysics to conceive coherent but unpersuasive and antagonistic intellectual systems resulted from the application of pure, transcendental concepts to arguments concerning the natures of things in themselves, noumena. The critical philosophy therefore restricts the jurisdiction of all concepts to the realm of possible appearance, intuition, suggesting, as we have seen, that the a priori forms of knowledge have no purchase on any reality transcending phenomenon. Oppositional terms are no longer accepted as descriptions capturing reality, but are interpreted as pure forms of reason that can only be meaningfully deployed theoretically when applied to objects of possible appearance, which fall within the legislative domain of the faculty, which Kant calls the understanding, Verstand. So to speak, that knowledge is only important, knowing is only important so long as we can understand it. Anything we can't understand or we don't have the capacity within our faculties to perceive of should be radically, we should inculcate ourselves against alterity by not contending with that which we can't essentially reassert reason onto. So the sublime, for instance, or the outside, alterity, these things, if we can't understand them, if we can't conceive of them within Verstand, within our faculty, then they should be radically excised from the domain of epistemological inquiry. And this is actually an area where I think both Nick Land and Jason Giorgiani, despite their differences, would agree, is that Kant essentially created a control system around excising alterity from the domain of human understanding. It's heretical, it's pushed to the side, it's a pariah, we don't deal with it. And what this does is it creates a framework which, when applied to economics, serves the purpose of creating human control systems around a fundamentally chaotic and rupturing and dissolving force, in this case, capitalism. We try to create a human control system around it, while the fact of the matter is that the outside is always trying to work its way in. I think that I want to say in Land's critique of Heidegger's reading of Trockle, I don't even know if I said that name right, talking about the wolves at the gates, the howling wolves outside the gates trying to get in. There is this lycanthropy with whatever a werewolf is, lycanthropy, I don't know, where there's this animality, there's this animal desire inside of us waiting to explode. I mean, Bataille talks about this as well with different language, but there's this desire to return to the continuity, to dissolve ourselves, to experience the sacred, which is sort of an animalistic urge, a Dionysian urge, and it's very overpowering, and it may overpower us in the end. And with capitalism, you're essentially trying to reap the rewards of this while also retaining subjectivity and not falling too far into exogamy, into chaos. But maybe it's just inevitable. And it's like swallowing an Ambien. That's one of my favorite analogies I use. You're swallowing an Ambien. You're trying to calm yourself down. You're taking your Vicodin as a painkiller, or you're taking your Xanax as an antidepressant, because you don't want to face the reality that alterity is going to come through. And if fascism does anything, it creates a more stable relationship with alterity, where we're making alterity a submissive lover to a degree. We are imposing our dominance over alterity. And if there's one thing I would say about fascism, which I certainly think is something that has to be considered, is maybe it goes too far. And in a research paper / book I plan to do called Eroticism in Rome, I'm going to be talking about the Romans attempted to do this, and unsuccessfully, where they asserted and inframed eroticism too stringently, which actually led to it exploding even more uncontrollably, rupturing society and the social dynamics of society in ways that it wouldn't have if you made a lover of Eros, if you treated the relationship like Mars and Venus. If you try too hard to control Eros, it will come back at you like Mentos in a Coke bottle. It will explode. You know what I mean? So that's something to consider. You can go too far in one direction or the other, but I would say that modern capitalistic system probably gives too much of its subjectivity away to capitalism. And we can see this today, Gunnar accelerationism. That's what it is, essentially, is that the human subject is going to lose himself to capitalism. I got to write about that too. Let me make a note of this. I have a lot of essays I plan to do. Gunnar accelerationism, loss of subjectivity, a Landian reading. I don't know, Landian reading to Gunnar accelerationism. When we spoke, I forget if I've mentioned this before, he said that he saw Gunnar accelerationism as sort of the next, I said it again, fuck. Every time I say that, I'm going to check myself, as the next evolution of Nietzsche's eternal recurrence. The last man and the Übermensch are pruned out of Gunnar accelerationism. Out of the Gunpods comes forth the last man and the greater man. That's how man, Gunnar accelerationism is a tightrope. It's a straight razor that we, the snails, are crawling across, and we either lose ourselves like Lance, we become soulless like Kurtz, or we endure like Willard. Maybe I'll publish my essay, Eroticism in Rome, because I don't know if I'm going to use it for my book, but I might just publish it and just see what people think. Maybe I'll use it for my book. Maybe I won't. I might just publish it and see what you guys think. Maybe I'll even link it here and see what happens. See if people enjoy it or not. I mean, it might be bullshit. I don't know. Anyway, maybe I'll rework it. Since reality is itself a transcendental concept, Kant's usage of a distinction between appearance and reality to restrict, did I already say this? No. To restrict the deployment of pure concepts already suggests a crucial difficulty with this project, since every attempt to formulate a relation or distinction between the phenomenal and the noumenal realms, the world as it appears to us or is understood, and the world as it is in itself, must itself relapse into the pre-critical and illegitimate deployment of conceptual thought. One crucial symptom of this is that the structure of Kantian critique itself perpetuates the oppositional form of metaphysical thought, since its resolution of the antinomies depends upon the mobilization of further dichotomies, in particular, those of transcendental/empirical, phenomenon, noumenon, conception, intuition, and analysis, synthesis. In other words, Kant still wants to say something about radical alterity, even if it is only that it has no relevance to us. Yet he has deprived himself of the right to all speculation about the nature of what is beyond appearance. The vocabulary that would describe the other of metaphysics is itself inscribed within metaphysics, since the inside and the outside are both conceptually determined from the inside, within a binary myth or cultural symptom of dual organization. It is thus the inhibition of synthesis, the delimitation of alterity in advance, that sets up the modern form of the ontological question. How do we know that matter exists? That the very existence of materiality is problematic for Enlightenment thought is symptomatic of the colonial trading systems that correspond to it. Alterity cannot be registered unless it can be inscribed within the system, according to the interconnected axes of exchange value, price, and the patronymic, or in other words, as a commodity with an owner. So ultimately, we have to have a relationship with the outside, with alterity, and we're saying it doesn't matter, yet we intrinsically are saying something about it. We have to deal with it. We have to have a relationship with it. So how are we going to shoot ourselves in the foot by saying we shouldn't consider it, yet at the same time, in saying we shouldn't consider it, we're still playing into it. We're still also using we shouldn't deal with it, we shouldn't have a relationship to it as justification for how we relate to it. So it becomes a it becomes this hypocritical, contradictory position, as you're saying has no relevance to us, yet the entire system is predicated on a reaction. It's reactionary. It's a reaction to alterity. And this is the whole thing with why Kant was afraid of the French Revolution, because of the instability it caused, and because of the violence it let loose, the violence it lets loose on civilization, his fear that might happen in Germany too. He's just trying to control alterity. And here, he's also trying to control alterity. So it's a reaction to alterity. Therefore, it's still determined by alterity. And in saying we shouldn't have a relation to alterity, you are creating a relation to alterity. Your relation to alterity is that we don't have a relation to alterity. So it collapses on itself, like House of Cards. What falls outside this recognized form is everything that resists commodification, the primordial independence that antedates the constitution of the destituted proletariat. As I have suggested, this inculcate mass of more or less explicit resistance to capital is isolated outside the metropolis by a combination of automatic economic processes, the concentration of poverty, and restrictive kinship practices. Modern capital has therefore brought about a fundamental dislocation between filiation and alliance by simultaneously deregulating alliance and abstracting it from all kinship implications. The primordial anthropological bond between marriage and trade is dissolved in order that capital can ethnically and geographically quarantine its consequences from itself. The question of racism, which arises under patriarchal capital, is the default of a global trade in women, a parochialism in the system of misogynistic violence, the non-emergence of transcultural exogamy, is thus more complex than it might seem, and is bound in profound but often paradoxical ways to the functioning of patriarchy and capital. Systematic racism is a sign that class positions within the general transnational economy are being distributed on racial basis, which implies an effective, if not a juridical, apartheid. Again, the xenophobic necessity to keep out exogamy and to retain the stable identity to actually be able to benefit as a subject from exchange and surplus. Because if we cease to be ourselves and we become a part of a blob, then who's really gaining? Nobody. We're part of the blob. We're part of undifferentiated libido. Kant was able to remain bourgeois without overtly promoting racism, only because he remained an idealist, or in other words, a Christian, a cunning Christian, as Nietzsche calls him, and identified universality with ideality rather than with power. Kant's economy of the concept, which is the assimilation of experience into a system of exchange values, is irresistible in principle and thus does not recognize the problem of rebellion. It is only with the implicit recognition of the need for a systematic evacuation of rebellion from the metropolis by means of a geographically distorted labor market that racism arises in its contemporary form, which is ultimately that of a restricted franchise on a national basis over the political management of the global means of production. It is no longer a question of taxation without representation, except by means of interest payments, but rather of a metropolitan capital seeking to abstract itself from all political reference, becoming offshore, although not to the extent that it loses its geopolitical condition of existence, the U.S. war machine. The increasingly rigorous differentiation of marriage from trade, or politics from economics, finds its ultimate conceptual definition in the thought of a moral agency which is utterly impervious to learning, communication, or exchange. Well, I don't know if I necessarily agree, but I get his point. It is in his second critique, the critique of practical reason, that Kant capitalizes upon the ethno-ethical consequences of the first, that justice must be prosecuted without negotiation. Kant's moral theory is an ethics of appropriative modernity and breaks with the parochial or scriptural morality of the ancient regime, where Judaic, Christian, and Islamic moral codes serve as legitimations of imperial projects in the periods of ascendancy. Kantian morality is, inversely, legitimated by the position of imperial or universal jurisdiction. Only that is moral which can be demanded of every rational being unconditionally. In the name of an ultra-empire that Kant names the empire of ends, Reich des Zweck, maybe, Zwecke? The law of this empire is called the categorical imperative, which means a law stemming solely from the purity of the concept, and thus dictated by the absolute monologue of colonial reason. In the purity of categorical morality, the incestuous bloodline of the pharaohs is still detectable, but sublimated into an impersonal administration. The law is that which cannot be legitimately discussed, and which is therefore an unresponsive or unilateral imposition. It is not difficult to see that the second critique distills the xenophobic violence of the first and elevates it to the most extreme possible fanaticism, where theoretical knowledge is open to a limited negotiation with alterity, practical or moral certainty is forbidden from entering into relation with anything outside itself except to issue commands. Kant's practical subject already prefigures as a deaf Führer, barking impossible orders that seem to come from another world. So, the interesting thing about the categorical imperative is essentially this is a means of keeping out the other as well, because when you have different, for example, the famous, or commonly when we talk about the categorical imperative, people say, well, what about a white lie? What about bending the rules for something good? Well, if you can bend the rules for something good, then you can justify any sort of action if it fits your own ends. So if your ends is you want to be powerful, then I'm not going to follow the law. It's like Caesar says. In all other cases but to take power, follow the law, meaning follow the law unless you can win. And if you can win, break the law. Therefore, alterity enters and stability, you get instability because now something other than the collective good is prioritized. Hence, the categorical imperative is the only way to create moral stability, because if you have laws that nobody can break, then nobody is going to make an exception for their own personal interests. So categorical imperative has to be universal for it to function, because otherwise we're going to bend the rules if it benefits us, versus if we follow a law to a T, it's going to create the stability, moral stability around the fact that there's not going to be any exceptions to breaking the rules. Therefore, people out of self-interest won't be able to take power as long as the categorical imperative is adhered to. And this is kind of the legal system as well. It's supposed to serve a similar purpose. But when he's talking about the deaf Führer and the sort of impossibility of his position. It's impossible because there's two opposing forces here. There's universalism and then there's xenophobia. Universalism of Kant doesn't have an explicit racial character, but to create stability, you need to retain that racial character. You need to retain that patrilineal line, that identity which can benefit from exchange, which can benefit from surplus. Therefore, trying to create this limited negotiation with alterity also actually breaks his own system, because universalism gives way to an exclusionary dynamic of identity. So the death Führer, he's giving orders that you can't follow. It's like, what the fuck am I supposed to do? You want me to be a universalist, or you want me to be a xenophobic person? So it's impossible to follow Kant's system, essentially, I think, is what Land's trying to say. How much more do we have left? Because I'm getting a little tired. All right, we're almost there. We'll get to cyber feminism soon. Oh, fun. Kant makes a further strenuous effort to push forward the horizon of a priori synthesis in his third critique, the critique of judgment. If the first critique corresponds to appropriative economy or commodification, and the second critique corresponds to imperial jurisdiction, the third critique corresponds to the exercise of war at those margins of the global system that continue to resist both the market and the administration. It is concerned with the type of pleasure that is experienced when an object demonstrates an extrajudicial submission or abasement before the faculty of judgment, an existence which Kant associates with the contemplation of beauty. Oh, I mentioned that earlier. The first critique already exhibits a conception of excess or a priori synthesis that generalizes the principles of the labor market to all objects of the theoretical cognition and transforms the understanding into a form of intellectual capital. In the third critique, there is a far more aggressive conception of excess, which generates a feeling of delight because it is essentially extortionate. Extortion, exploitation too. This excess is not a surplus of certainty stemming from dimensions of objectivity possessed in advance of intuition, and thus by right, but rather a surplus of purchase upon the object. Kant argues that we have no transcendental right to expect natural laws to be sufficiently homogeneous for us to grasp. When confronting the heterogeneity of intuition, reason must engage in a kind of Pascalian wager, assuming an intelligible system of nature because nothing to lose by not doing so. Submission of the outside in general to the inside in general, or of nature to the idea, i.e. conquest, is not guaranteed by any principle. The capitalist feels a neutral satisfaction in the production of normal profits, but the conqueror feels exultation in the attainment of victory, precisely because there was no reason to expect it. Kant's advice to the imperial war machine in his third critique can be summarized as this: treat all resistance as if it were less than you might justifiably fear. The critique of judgment thus projects the global victory of capitalized reason as pure and exuberant ambition. So one thing I want to say about this, about the conqueror, that's alterity to me. That's fascism. Why does fascism triumph? Because people want exaltation. They want the victory that there was no reason to expect. They don't want to win within the system. There's nothing beautiful in that. It's just the heterogeneous seeks to impose itself over the homogeneous. You could play the game, you can make your slop, you can make your money, but you don't exist. You don't exist. There's no identity in that. Fascism sneaks between the cracks of capitalism, because in capitalism, you don't exist. You're just a meat puppet. So the more you become a meat puppet, the more that capitalism, the essence of capitalism, imposes its libidinal will over human subjectivity, the more that we become fascist, the more that we want to reassert our subjectivity, because we want a victory that we didn't expect. We want flux. We want a certain bit of chaos. We want a chaos that we experience as individuals, not that we don't experience at all, because we're so tapped into the libidinal will of capitalism that we cease to exist, as independent particulars within the substance of history. To exist in history, we have to be something. And if we're nothing, we're not experiencing anything. So it doesn't matter that I'm in my IKEA nesting furniture bullshit from Fight Club, the narrator in Fight Club. He doesn't exist. He only exists once he starts rupturing the system, and once he starts tapping into a more primordial, violent will, which I think is that of the conqueror, is that of fascism, the attainment of victory when there was no reason to expect it. Existing as an independent entity, not within the system, because the system numbs you, because you learn to mind your P's and Q's, to do your 9 to 5s, and you get what's expected, you get what's coming to you. That's not what we want. We want loss. We want loss in a way that exists only by being. You need being to lose. In capitalism, you're in a perpetual state of loss, and you're in a perpetual state of being at the same time, because you've gotten so controlled. You have a system that controls everything you do. Everything's perfected, but you also are in a constant state of regulated dopaminergic responses where you have comfort, you have an excess of comfort. There isn't this highs and lows. We need highs and lows. We need lows so we can experience the highs. We've been brought down to a base level, efficiently curtailed through media, medication, the food we eat, the little subliminal messaging and how our houses are arranged all look alike. This is all to make us stagnant in our fluctuation of emotions, because we won't be able to feel as much if we're just kept in this constant steady state. And the same applies to identity. Rather than identity fluctuating, you could be a slave, you could be a conqueror. We're just the middle man. We're somewhere in between the proletariat and the bourgeois. I mean, maybe in the metropolis, the proletariat ceases to really exist. I mean, at one point they were saying 90% of the American population was middle class. I mean, how many people are actually working labor jobs in America? I don't know. So the only possible politics of purity is fascism, or militant activism rooted in the inhibitory and exclusive dimensions of a metropolitanism. Racism, as a regulated, automatic, and indefinitely suspended process of genocide, as opposed to the hysterical and unsustainable genocide of the Nazis, is the real condition of persistence for a global economic system that is dependent upon an aggregate price of labor approximating to the cost of its bare subsistence, and therefore upon an expanding pool of labor power, which must be constantly stimulated into this market by an annihilating poverty. If fascism is evaded in metropolitan societies, it is only because a chronic passive genocide trails in the wake of capital and commodity markets as they displace themselves around the third world, disciplining the labor market, ensuring that basic commodity prices are not high enough to distribute capital back into primary producer societies. So this is what I was saying earlier about essentially a monopoly on economic opportunity, both in the South African apartheid state and in the global metropolis, which is the first world. You don't let them gain as much as you're gaining so that they can't accumulate enough capital to actually sustain themselves. You keep them reliant upon yourself as the market for their goods, which is why China is becoming more powerful, because they're starting to build a domestic internal market. They're not completely there yet, but they're getting there. So it makes them less reliant on the global market. However, they're still very reliant on the global market. The forces most unambiguously antagonistic to this grotesque process are exogamic, or less humanistically, exotropic. Synthetic energies that condition all surplus value and yet coexist with capital only under repression. A radical international socialism would not be a socialist ideology generalized beyond its culture of origin, but a program of collectivity or unrestrained synthesis that springs from the theoretical and libidinal dissolution of national totality. To get to a world without nations would in itself guarantee the achievement of all immediate post-capitalist social and economic goals. It is this revolutionary requirement for a spontaneously homeless subversion that gives an urgency to certain possibilities of feminist politics, since the erasure of matrilineal genealogy within the patriarchal machine means that fascistizing valorations of ancestry have no final purchase on the feminine subject. The patronymic has irrevocably divested all the women who fall under it on any recourse to an ethno-geographical identity. Only the twin powers of father and husband suppress the nomadism of the anonymous female fluxes that patriarchy oppressively manipulates, violates, and psychiatrizes. By allowing women some access to wealth and social prestige, the liberalization of patriarchy has sought to diffuse the explosive force of this anonymity, just as capital has tended to reduce the voluptuous excess of exogamic conjugation to the stability of national segmented trading circuits. The increasingly incestual character of economic order, reaching its zenith in racist xenophobia, is easily masked as a series of feminist reforms of patriarchy, as a decommodification of women, a diminution of the obliterating effects of the patronymic, and a return to the mother. This is the sentimental feminism that Nietzsche despised and whose petit bourgeois nationalist implications he clearly saw. Only resolutely revolutionary politics is feminist in orientation, but only if the synthetic forces mobilized under patriarchy are extrapolated beyond the possibility of assimilation, rather than being criticized from the perspective of mutilated genealogies. Genealogy is the dissipation of recuperative origins, Nietzsche, not as sentimental nostalgia. So essentially saying that women don't benefit from patronymic exogamy because only the male line, the male name benefits, right? So they're kind of a secondary in this according to Land. Therefore, they represent the chaotic, rupturous force, the other. They're they who can dissolve the patriarchal and create a open up alterity. It's interesting though, really quick. Maybe I'll look at the end, but I think I have a feeling that my version of this essay that I read on my Kindle, I just didn't want to use that because I didn't know if it was going to be copyrighted or whatever, because it's a free PDF. I feel like there was a part that they didn't have in this that they had in my essay. I'm going to go back through this after and just double check, but let me finish. The women of the earth are segmented only by their fathers and husbands. Their praxial fusion is indistinguishable from the struggle against the micropowers that suppress them most immediately. That is why the proto-fascism of nationality laws and immigration controls tend to have a sexist character as well as a racist one. It is because women are the historical realization of the potentially euphoric, synthetic, or commutative function which patriarchy both exploits and inhibits that they are invested with a revolutionary destiny. And it is only through their struggle that politics will be able to escape from all fatherlands. Really quick, let me just say that this relates to what I'm going to be doing with eroticism in Rome, where women, I think, are more in tune with the sacred, with continuity of experience. Because when you think of the good, they're more receptive of the good. Men have to assert themselves onto reality to have the power to seek the good. So, for example, if you're a beautiful woman and you're relatively of good character, the man is intended to be the one that pursues you. And gains you as the good, whereas the man has to make himself. He has to create himself. He doesn't wait for the good to seek him. He is the penetrator. He seeks out. He has to become, maybe he has to become handsome, or he has to become successful, or in the past he had to become powerful, and then he gets the beautiful woman. Again, to go back to Scarface, in this country, first you got to make the money, then you make the power, then you get the woman. You have to make yourself to penetrate the woman, whereas the woman is more so the receptive and a medium to the sacred, where you penetrate the woman and she's getting penetrated by you, and you both experience the sacred, the continuity of existence. But the woman is more receptive. She's more in tune. This whole idea about women being hysterical, I don't think it's really true, but it's true in the sense that women are more emotional for a reason, because they're more attuned with nature. The whole concept of man, whether it's sociological or biological, is to assert himself onto nature, is to build, is to expand its power. That's how the good comes to man, is through expansion of his power and asserting his will onto reality. Whereas with the woman, for better or worse, your value is kind of going to be, at least for most of human history, you can argue about it now, is going to be determined by genetics. You're going to either be born beautiful, or you're going to be born into a noble bloodline where your father can marry you off to a good suitor, or you'll be beautiful enough to find a good mate. But ultimately, you're born with the capabilities you're going to have in this life. And then good character is always nice. Whereas with a man, right, you're not born with anything. You're not born with value. Your value comes through time. Now, granted, you can be born into a good family. That'll help you out a lot. But ultimately, you have to assert yourself onto reality. There's a lot more fluctuation in terms of, it's the whole thing with hypergamy. The idea that the top 10% of men have access to 90% of women. This is where this idea comes from. Men have to assert themselves onto reality to receive the good, whereas women are already in a position to receive the good. They're more in touch with nature. They're receptive. So it's not trying to sound sexist. I think that's just how it is. Women don't pursue men in the sexual marketplace. Men pursue women. Now, granted, it's been inverted a little bit. Not that women pursue men, but that this gender dynamics are all fucked up today, whether for good or bad. But generally speaking, men have more ability to rise and fall within the social standing. Wars can lead to the lower class replacing the higher class. It can lead to a peripheral state or peripheral people, the steppe tribes or the Goths or the Germanics coming in and supplanting the Romans or the Greeks or so on and so forth. It can lead to a weaker people, or maybe not necessarily weaker, but more vigorous people with less capital accumulated to find a more civilized people who've grown weak and decadent and take them over. That's a male thing to do. You don't really do that as a woman. As a woman, you kind of flow with the tides of history. And I think this is what Land is talking about in regards to women don't really benefit from this system, from patronymic exogamy, because the successes, the identity, which actually accumulates, is the male line, is the male identity. Women are just kind of there. They're almost a commodity or a product or a good to be traded, a good to show your status, rather than actually benefiting from the accumulation. They're part of the accumulation. If you become a rich and wealthy man, you get the good woman. And even today, you have a career woman. Ultimately, what is the meaning of life? It's probably to have sex with somebody you're attracted to and have kids and have a family. Becoming a career woman and making a lot of money isn't really going to get you closer to that. Whereas a man, it will get you closer to that. It gives you more variety over who you can pick. But you could be the most successful woman in the world, but at the end of the day, the amount of sexual capital that you can purchase with your money is going to be a lot less than a man. A man purchases sexual capital more so with his money than a woman does. A woman's sexual capital is herself. Whereas with a man, his sexual capital is his status, his success, his power. Not to go all red pill, because I don't really give a fuck, but that's kind of how it is. So I think you understand my point here. And this is why feminism can be incredibly insurrectionary and revolutionary, and what Land gets into, where women can also be an instrument of alterity, which is very interesting. And again, I'm all for not inframing Eros. You should make a lover of Eros. I'm not saying we should, make women possessions or anything. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that's bad. Not because of moral reasons, but because it's not, I think, how this correct relationship goes. It's Venus and Mars. You have to be the strong masculine man, and the woman should be very feminine. But truly erotic encounters, and I talked about this with Georgiani, true erotic encounters come from consent. I know we like to make our jokes, Yamnaya, step tribesman, goes and captures Neolithic farmer wife and makes her his wife and gives shrunk babies. But ultimately, there is an irrational element to romance. We want somebody to be attracted to us, to want us, to romantically desire us. That's where the greatest ecstasy comes from. It comes from being loved, even if love is this irrational, novel thing that doesn't really have any bearing. It might as well exist. It's an abstraction that's real, to pull from Baudrillard's definition of the technological plane. Love is an abstraction that's real. We want to be loved. We desire it. Therefore, we desire consent. Therefore, we desire somebody that's not our slave. Really. I think that's much more attractive. And if you think about this, this is represented in history as well. If you think about the Matrona and the Infamia in Rome, because this is something I'm studying right now. The Matrona, the wife, is the possession. But then there's the Infamia too. There's the prostitutes and so on and so forth. It's a very Italian thing, the Madonna and whore phenomena, which you also see in the Italian mafia, where you have your wife who's kind of seen as possession, and you have the mistress who's a little bit chaotic. She might be a little bit toxic. That's where the romance comes from. So even in this patriarchal system, there's still this element which desires the erotic, which desires romance, which desires consent, whereas the wife is more so a possession. And I think that's a bad system, because I think that the more you try to enframe the erotic through possession of the feminine, I think it bites you in the ass eventually. And maybe that's what we're seeing now. So I'm not a misogynist by any means. However, I'm not saying it should be 50-50 necessarily. I think phenomenally, men are the higher gender, but nominally women are the higher gender. Women are superior nominally, men are superior phenomenally, if that makes sense. Women have something that we want, and we want them to give it to us willingly. And in that, they have more power. We have more power in the sense that we can remake ourselves to be someone that's more deserving of love and romance. Whereas a woman, you're kind of born like you're born, and that's going to determine your sexual capital, thus your erotic capital. So who would you rather be? Well, if you're born a beautiful woman, a lot less or fewer life struggles. But if you're born an ugly man, you might be able to transvalue that upwards. If you're born an ugly woman, you can't transvalue that upwards, right? So it's like, who's superior? I don't know. But to continue, in her meticulous studies of patriarchy, Luce Irigare has amply demonstrated the peculiar urgency of the feminist question, although the political solutions she suggests are often feebly nostalgic, sentimental, and pacifistic. Perhaps only Monique Wittig has adequately grasped the inescapable military task faced by any serious revolutionary feminism, and it is difficult not to be dispirited by the enormous reluctance women have shown historically to prosecute their struggle with sufficient ruthlessness and aggression. Kind of like what Sorel says with parliamentary socialism, the more you create concessions, like for example, this is the patriarchal liberalization, the liberalization of patriarchy, which gives women jobs and rights and the ability to kind of be equal feminism, but it doesn't go far enough for him because he wants full revolution. He wants full inversion. He doesn't want gradual steps that don't lead to anything. Same thing with Sorel. Sorel says we need the general strike. We need revolution. We need violence. This parliamentary bullshit is not going to lead anywhere. It's just going to lead to people growing soft because they have a little bit of a concession. They're comfortable with that and they don't want to revolt anymore. Conditions of revolt require that we don't have, that we're kept down, so that we actually want to revolt and exact violence on the political class and have a revolution of the system. The left tends to be evasive about the numbing violence intrinsic to revolutionary war, and feminism is often particularly fastidious in this respect, even reverting to absurd mystical and Gandhian ideologies. True. If feminist struggles have been constantly deprioritized in theory and practice, it is surely because of their idealistic recoil from the currency of violence, which is to say, only the definitive matter of politics. The state apparatus of an advanced industrial society can certainly not be defeated without willingness to escalate the cycle of violence without limit. It is a terrible fact that atrocity is not the perversion, but the very motor of such struggles, the language of inexorable political will. A revolutionary war against a modern metropolitan state can only be fought in hell. It is this harsh truth that has deflected Western politics into an increasingly servile reformism, whilst transforming nationalist struggles into the sole arena of vigorous contention against particular configurations of capital. But, as I hope I have demonstrated, such nationalist struggles are relevant only to the geographical modulation of capital, not to the radical jeopardizing of neo-colonialism, inhibited synthesis as such. Victorious third world struggles, so long as they have been successfully localized, do not lead to realistic post-capitalist achievements, and certainly not to post-patriarchal ones, since the conversion of the form of the nation-state itself, enough to guarantee the reinsertion of a society into the system of inhibited synthesis. For as long as the dynamic of guerrilla war leads to new men at the top, with all that this entails in terms of the communication between individuated sovereignties, history will continue to look bleak. For it is only when the pervasive historical bond between masculinity and war is broken by effective feminist violence that will become possible to envisage the uprooting of the patriarchal endogamies that orchestrate the contemporary world order. With the abolition of the inhibition of synthesis, of Kantian thought, assorted cowardice will be washed away, and cowardice is the engine of greed. But the only conceivable end of Kantianism is the end of modernity, and to reach this, we must foster new Amazons in our midst. There you go. Cyberfeminism, CCRU revolution. Yeah. So that's that. I'm going to go back really quick just to see if they had that line that I was thinking of that I thought I missed. But I could have just, this was a really long video, so I could have just forgot it. Do they have it? Let me see. Okay, yeah. All right, it was here. It was the thing where he says the disaster of world history is that capitalism was never the progressive unwinding of this stuff. So he did say, I just forgot about it. But anyway, long-ass video. I hope you watched to the end because I think this was a good video, important video. If you guys like me doing readings of essays, please let me know. I'll do more of them. I did one about Bataille last time, but I think I did the mistake of turning it into multiple videos because the first one did really well and the second one didn't do as well. So I'm gonna try to do these in one goes, even if I get sleepy, EP, because I'm doing my Goy slave job. Zizek's right. Mikey Downs is right. Time energy, bro. I just disagree with thinking everyone should be liberated. Not everyone's gonna be liberated. That's where I disagree. Now the Marxist position seems to be that we can only win through collective liberation. Maybe you're right. I don't know, but I don't believe that. At least right now. Changed my mind. Steven Crowder. No, I'm kidding. But fuck that guy. Steven Crowder, that is. The other two guys are cool. Zizek and Mikey Downs are cool. watch. Yeah. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. I thought I did a decent job, minus the one slip up. I'm really thinking maybe I should publish this Eroticism in Rome first chapter because it was good, but I'm going to rework it for the book because it doesn't work for the book. I don't know. We'll see. But I gave you some sneak peeks into it. I opened with an analogy to Colonel Kurtz in Apocalypse Now. I start off with his quote where it's, "I watched a snail crawl along the edge of a straight razor. That's my dream. That's my nightmare. Crawling, slithering along the edge of a straight razor and surviving." Maybe I'll just do an essay on Apocalypse Now and then an essay on Truman Show. I kind of gave you the rundown of what I'm going to talk about in the Truman Show. Sylvia in the Truman Show is Alterity. Feminism, cyber violence, everybody. I'm a feminist now. I'm a Landian feminist. A proto-Landian feminist. I don't know what the fuck that would even mean. Kidding. But anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. Look at the jawline. I kind of want to take my shirt off and show you the physique because I'm like, I guess I could. Fuck it. I'll show you the physique. 1 second. So I started lifting a little more recently because I kind of not been lifting that much, but I'm lifting again. I want to start MMA again too. I'm stinky. I kind of like my smell though. It's very masculine. Yeah, fuck cyberfeminism. Venus and Mars. Let's learn to love each other. You know, we don't got to go to war. We'll find a way to work together, synthesize. You know. Anyway, as always, this is the Warrior Philosopher, building the foundations of the Warrior Philosophy. And we will see you next time. Awe no Roma, Awe Caesar. We'll give an Awe Nick Land. We'll make him an honorary legate of New Rome. And we'll see you next time with another video. Peace.